everyone. The day of conversation is continuing here. I hope that all of our technical difficulties have now been resolved because now we're going to get into some really deep and important conversations. And this first one here today is talking about reclaiming recovery and moving beyond that systemic shame. And it's actually a continuation on a conversation that we started, I think it was back in July or August. It was definitely hotter outside back then. I remember that. But Dr. Lester, it is good to have you back again with us to talk about reclaiming recovery. I'm excited to co-host alongside my amazing colleague, Lerone, today. And I would love to give both of you an opportunity just to introduce yourselves real quick before we dive on in.
Great. Shall I jump in, I guess? Thank you so much for having me back. My name is Rebecca Lester. I am a professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. I am also a licensed clinical social worker with a private psychotherapy practice, and I specialize in treating eating disorders.
And I'm a senior program coordinator at ANID. My name is Liron, and I also develop volunteer trainings at ANID. And I'm really excited to continue on the conversation we started and taking it to new places. I feel it's going to be a really good one.
Yeah, when we got together a little bit ago to kind of brainstorm what the conversation was going to look like today. And this is one of them. I think it could have filled all 12 hours of our entire day of conversation because there's so much to talk about. But I think to get things started, it would be great to name the problem and to talk about how recovery might be defined in the dictionary as one thing or defined by a doctor as one thing, but it looks different for everybody. So kind of diving into what recovery really means.
Well, I think that is the question of the hour, right? What does it mean? It's something that holds such a prominent place in all of our discourses around eating disorder. I mean, not just eating disorder, certainly broader than that, but for our purposes today, as the thing that we, aspire to when somebody's in treatment or trying to get better, that there's this ideal of recovery, but it means so many different things to different people. It's really a very ambiguous term and that produces a lot of problems.
Yeah, and I think the irony is that there is no one singular, globally agreed upon definition of recovery. And we always say that recovery is a very personal journey, but at the same time, it feels like there is some vague kind of nondescript definition of recovery that we're always trying to live up to that might breed a lot of shame, that might cause difficulty with access to treatment, that might cause difficulty with access to jobs or other places that we might continue that shame from the eating disorder to the recovery. So that's really what we wanted to kind of take apart today a little bit.
Yeah. And I know one of the things that we were talking about is how recovery is a personal journey, but is it really? That's I think a great question because a lot of times it feels like recovery is being defined for us by other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think both those things are true in a sense. I think the definitions of kind of what are the benchmarks of recovery often do tend to be defined by insurance companies or physicians or the media or wherever it's coming from. How somebody might try to get there is a very personal journey, but I think that's part of the tension, right? Is that we have this kind of one size fits all model of what people are quote unquote supposed to aspire to, and then very little supports for figuring out, first of all, is that where we want to go, and then how would we get there?
I think also a lot of the time the emphasis is on behaviors, and one of the things that we talked about is that some of those things are very hard to measure in a concrete way, and that maybe when we talk about recovery being a personal journey, for some of us, we're talking about personal growth and about quality of life and other things that are not measured by some of those institutions or systems.
Yeah, I was thinking about my own recovery journey, and it was really difficult for me because it felt like once I had restored weight and once I had gotten to those physical benchmarks, I guess you could say that were put in place, my team kind of drifted away a little bit. It was kind of like, okay, you're good now, continue on. But for me, that is when it was really starting. That is when I needed the most support. Because yeah, it was one thing to follow a meal plan and do these things, but there was still a lot of work left to do. And I think that that can leave a lot of people feeling like they're in limbo, and that can be a very scary milestone to hit in the recovery journey.
And in fact, sometimes it might even kind of echo that eating disorder voice as you're measured by those markers, by the things that they ask you not to measure your worth on. But insurance companies, or again, doctors, clinicians do measure your progress in recovery based on those things, because the rest of it is a little bit more amorphous or ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you just said is also really a critical piece, that oftentimes it's at the point where people need the most support that those systems start to fall away because of this match. Like, oh, you've been weight restored, then great, you're good to go. Our work here is done. And that's often, like you said, when it really, starts, or at least enters a different phase that still requires a lot of support.
There's also this point that people reach where there's questioning by providers, professionals, those around us, who it's like, are you recovered enough? Like, are you safe now to have the autonomy in your recovery and to be active in your recovery? Or I know, like, even here at ANID with our peer support programs, are you recovered enough to now be a peer support provider? And it's very cloudy, that line of where is an individual at a place in their recovery where they can ensure that they're not doing harm to themselves or harm to others.
Mm-hmm.
I think that with eating disorders, more than with other disorders, probably, maybe even the only singular disorder that happens with, that there is that fear oftentimes from clinicians that somebody who's not recovered enough would cause harm. And I think the fear is more that they would cause harm to others than to themselves. And I was thinking about, what is this, when we think about, there's this standard of recovery that we have to meet to be recovered enough in order to be, my feeling was always, in order to be worthy of something. And I was trying to ask myself, worthy of what? And it was worthy of trust of others, yes. Trust for myself, because there's something so, even throughout the recovery journey and the treatments, we are not supposed to trust ourselves. We're supposed to put our trust into others who tell us what we need to do. But recovery is a process of hopefully regaining trust in yourself. So it's so tricky to navigate. When is that line crossed and I can trust myself and others can trust me?
Yeah, I think that is such, really the crux of it. Because like you said, in treatment, we're taught like all the things that we feel, certain about are wrong. And so we have to like re-explore all of that. And there's some truth to that to a point. But yeah, I think that the kind of really deep, kind of unsettling of what the trust in yourself to be able to just assess, like, how am I doing? How am I in the world? Am I in a good place or not? It gets very shaky, and that makes it difficult to move forward. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think another really interesting kind of nuance of eating disorder recovery is where that competition aspect might come into play. And I know, Dr. Lester, this is something that we've talked about before, but when it comes up with the pro-ANA accounts that might be out there, or bringing individuals together, such as we do here at ANID, and just making sure that we put guidelines into place to ensure that they're not harming each other or saying things that could be triggering or encouraging further eating disorder behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very difficult component of eating disorders that I think it's, you don't really see in other conditions. As far as I'm aware, I don't know about with other substance abuse kinds of things. I think still think it's different. And I think that's where this issue of trust and who are you a risk to stays central for a long time.
And I do want to mention that we here at ANID train our volunteers very well, because nobody wants to cause harm. And so we just talk about what are the ways to talk about things, what are some of the ways to frame certain experiences, because at ANID, all of our volunteers, their personal experience is their superpower. That's what they're here to use. It's just a matter of how you do that. And it's really beautiful to see people start to craft their own story in a way that's empowering and inspiring to others. And it really shows also the process that they've gone through with interacting with their own story, and how meaningful that is to go through that process of having lived it and then being able to be the role model to talk about it in a safe and helpful and beneficial way. And, you know, in many ways, I see that also as part of the sort of like a separate later stage in the recovery journey for a lot of people, that being able to do that and be that for somebody else completes, in a way, the recovery journey or takes it to the next level.
And it's one thing that I want to point out to people who might be listening now, or perhaps you're thinking about attending an ANID peer support group and you're worried that you could say something unintentionally that could be harmful or triggering to somebody else. And again, we've got those guidelines in place where we're here to help guide the conversation and keep it safe. But it also comes down to recovery is not perfect, and we're not perfect. And there's going to be times where we might slip up and we say something, and we understand that. We get that. And we work with you. It's a gentle nudge. But I will often have people ask me, well, how did you start sharing your story so early on in your own recovery? Like, how did you feel comfortable with that? And it was one of those things that as soon as I got that urge, as soon as I knew I needed to start sharing my story, it was very healing. It became a part of my recovery journey. So you don't have to wait until you're at this, point where you think you're going to be completely safe and you've got everything under control. You can start to share your story whenever you want to, because it can be an integral part of that recovery and that healing journey.
And I think that goes back to the trust question. I see so many volunteers, when they dare speak up, they say, I don't know if I'm recovered enough to do this. They have so much imposter syndrome. And I think that part of what we do is to empower people, again, to kind of move past those concerns of I've gotten all these messages, I've internalized all these messages that I can't be trusted, that, and I always wonder if it's the same voice that says you're not sick enough during the eating disorder, if it's the same voice that says you're not recovered enough. But if so, it's like, label it as this is something that's just kind of nipping at my heels. I'm not paying attention. I'm learning to trust myself, and I'm learning to really appreciate what my life story and what I've been through can do to help others.
Absolutely. I think, owning your own story, and even discovering what that is, you don't have to know what it is to start, right? It's part of the discovery process, but nobody knows your experience more than you. You are the world's expert on your experience. So absolutely, starting, even if you don't feel 100% ready, I think, feeling 100% ready for anything is rare. And usually when people feel that way, they're wrong. So, you are the world's expert on your own experience. Yeah.
One of the suggestions that I always share with folks, and this helped me a lot, was I didn't know how I was going to tell my friends and my family that I had an eating disorder after spending so long telling everybody I'm fine and everything's good, and then telling everyone. So my therapist suggested that I write my story out, and maybe that way I could better share it with people. And I wrote it out, and then I read it back to myself. And as I read it back to myself, that's the first time I actually learned and understood my story. And I think that is so true for a lot of us, is we don't even know our own stories until we really take time to reflect upon it and look at things. And we're the most important audience. Before you can share it with anybody else, you've got to share your story with yourself. So I always tell folks, get that objective perspective on your story, write it out, write it like you're talking about a character in a story or something, because that's oftentimes when you can see who you authentically are and what you've gone through.
I think also it's really important to have grace for your ongoing journey. Oftentimes when I talk to volunteers, especially at the interview phase, when I ask, what is recovery to you? What does it mean to you? And I think a lot of the time, the understanding that comes at some point for a lot of us that it's an ongoing journey, that there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining it throughout our lives as the decades go by, and we see that, with every new challenge, with every new situation that happens as you mature, with other things that happen in life, that this is something that we oftentimes have to manage. And that goes back to that question of what is recovered enough, because sometimes people think, well, if I still have these thoughts, if I'm still managing urges, if I still, find myself having to do the work, does it mean that I'm recovered enough? And for a lot of us who are also managing chronic illness and trauma and neurodiversity and a bunch of other things, the reality, and a lot of the time a reality shrouded in grief, is that it's an ongoing situation that we live with. And it might feel, there might be an element of shame there or needing to hide. And so we wanted to validate that, and we wanted to kind of put it out there in the open that that is also a completely valid experience. And you're not judged by any kind of achievement, but just by getting up in the morning and continuing to make recovery-oriented choices to the best of your ability.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I wanted to go back and kind of touch on is, Laron, you mentioned it with the eating disorder voice, and I think that that is one thing that we should talk about more, because for me, I know that eating disorder voice and my own voice were intertwined for such a long time, and recovery for me was figuring out what was what, who was who. But I'm curious, how does the system and the way that things are currently set up actually amplify that eating disorder voice, especially when it comes to trying to heal and start that recovery journey?
Mhm. That's a big part of what I was exploring in my book Famished, is the way that our mental health system in the United States, managed care, the delivery of care, splitting things up into little buckets and then rationing resources, really just amplifies, like you said, that voice of I'm not sick enough, I don't deserve things, I don't deserve care, I don't deserve to be well and happy and comfortable or any of those things. And it becomes part of the institutional architecture of recovery and a lot of treatment centers, and not because they want it to be, but that's how the system works. And I think that is a really significant problem that we have to figure out how to intervene with.
If you have not read Dr. Lester's Famished, highly recommended. Just taking the moment to say that. I think that's also a big question about identity, because a lot of the time we're quote unquote accused of merging with the eating disorder as our identity. But at the same time, a lot of the time, I think for a lot of us, we feel in those treatments that we are being identified with the eating disorder. And so it is kind of what you're saying, there's so much the system does that just amplifies and entrenches the eating disorder. And we say this a lot, but in no other condition, disease, disorder, will the system blame the patient for not getting better, but it will take responsibility for not coming up with a good enough treatment. And this doesn't happen in eating disorders, that it so much compounds that eating disorder voice and the shame.
Yeah, so how does this systemic shame really impact people? And I think that's kind of the next area that we want to navigate the conversation towards, is what are some of the direct impacts that this shame can have on individuals as they're trying to recover?
Some of the things that I've seen, I mean, there's a lot of impacts. I mean, some of it is just being willing to reach out for help to start with. Um, there is so much shame already bound up with an eating disorder. And then when it's put into this, through the system that is, amplifying all of that, the sense of like going into trying to get help by already feeling like you failed is very detrimental. And then, of course, that gets kind of compounded as you go along. So that is a really big one. I think a key piece I've seen, in addition to kind of the loss of self-trust, is that element of hope, of thinking like, I've already failed before I've even started, and there's no way out of this. And so that, I think, is really a core problem.
I think also, and I don't know, this is something I personally experienced. I don't know if it's something that everybody shares, but there's this, to me, going throughout treatment was a deep sense of I'm broken and I need to be fixed. And again, we talk a lot about trust and about how recovery is regaining. I mean, even when we talk about intuitive eating, which we're supposed to be able to achieve at some point, it's all about learning to listen to yourself and trust yourself. And it seems to be at its core somewhat in contradiction with what we are trying to do in treatment. And so, and I understand that that is something that has to happen in treatment to get people to a certain place. But just acknowledging that that is really, really tricky to find that balance, to navigate, is really important. And I think that also when a system has these kind of rigid ideas of what recovery is, and oftentimes they're based in those certain physical markers or behavioral markers, it oftentimes can lead to labeling people as resistant to change, to treatment, or things that can really deprive people of hope and set their whole recovery on a different trajectory because they've gotten the message that they are not worthy or that they are incapable and are hopeless. And I think that is such a dangerous message to give anybody about anything.
Yeah, one of the interesting messages that came out of our conversation when we were brainstorming this was kind of the double standard that exists around how we're often accused of merging our identities into the eating disorder. But then on the flip side, society kind of turns around and does that to us, where they won't look at us outside of the eating disorder. And I think that that's a really interesting characteristic that I'd love to dive a little bit more into, because I know that there's a lot of people out there who feel like that, where there is that double standard that does exist.
I think we see that definitely. I mean, certainly in the clinical space, even, physicians, I was just having a conversation earlier today about the fact that medical education on eating disorders, like in the required medical curriculum, is practically nil, right? And so the idea of like, oh, this person is an eating disorder patient and what that is thought to mean starts, in the clinical space, but certainly outside as well in society. It's this idea that there's this collection of personality features or, untrustworthiness or manipulativeness or whatever that gets kind of lumped in there, and that follows people. And that's a large part due to ignorance, of course, but we need to figure out some way of communicating about that because it's really profound. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about is that for some people, it seems like eating disorders almost seem like a lifestyle choice because people struggle to understand why can't people just eat, because to them it comes naturally, and so it's something that seems like it should be the entirely under the control or the choice of the person. And even with, we talked about pro-ana and this idea of harming others, even this idea of trying to recruit others or eating disorders being contagious. And so a lot of the time there's something that I wonder how much people are concerned that there will be judgment if others find out that they have an eating disorder or have had an eating disorder. And for me, a lot of the time it was even just being in the profession of what I do, or wanting to speak to certain elements of recovery. And thankfully, Anna does that so well. So I've reclaimed my voice. But for a long time, I felt that if somebody knew about my history, then my voice would be gone. They wouldn't listen to me because they wouldn't consider me objective. I would immediately be put into that box of, oh, well, your brain works differently and we can't really listen to you. And that is a very, very difficult place to be in.
I run into that too with a lot of our student ambassadors when I'm talking to them, because they're concerned about going public with their eating disorder journey and stuff, because they worry it could impact their college applications, it could impact future job opportunities. And it's just so sad to see that even in recovery, there is so much shame around eating disorders. And I think that's one of the things that we notice here at ANID, when it can become difficult to recruit volunteers even, because we're rooted in peer support and that lived experience. And people are scared that once they associate themselves with our organization, they're going to be labeled as having an eating disorder. And there's going to be that shame that society has.
I work with a lot of pre-med students at Washington University, and there have been a number of times working with students who are preparing their applications for medical school. They always ask, like, what is your motivation for wanting to become a doctor? And for some people, it is having gone through an eating disorder and treatment that was not satisfactory or was satisfactory, whatever the reason. And the real agony that these students have about, like, can I write about this? I'm scared to put this in my application. And if it had been something else, like a heart defect or, some, of course you would write about that, and that would be a strength, and they would see that as resilience and all of that. But it's very different when it's an eating disorder. And so that is a factor for sure.
Yeah, as a gay man, this is something that relates to me too, is it's like every time I meet somebody new and it feels like I have to come out to them again. Yeah, I have to share that. The eating disorder is kind of the same thing where it's like I have to decide, am I comfortable enough sharing this with the other person? And it gets really interesting when that's my job and that's my role. So, somebody asks you what you do for work and you're like, oh, I work at an eating disorder nonprofit. But it's one of those things where there's always that thought, that split second of kind of the question, is this a safe place for me to share this? Or am I going to be shamed? Am I going to be outcast? Am I going to be labeled?
And I think that even though as we were brainstorming this, we kept coming back to this question of why is it that way? Why? And we couldn't really find a good enough answer. And maybe that will be another book, Dr. Lester, in your future, exploring that. But what I do find very comforting is knowing that ANID is part of the solution, because and again, this for me personally, but also for a lot of the people that come to us for volunteers and beneficiaries, sometimes we are the first and only place, like when they pick up the phone and call the helpline, sometimes it's the first time they've ever spoken to anybody about their experience. Or when they come to volunteer, this is the first time they're really, again, reclaiming that as something that they can do something powerful and positive with. And I think that this is being able to raise the voice of people with lived experience and claim our place at our seat at the table where other people are talking about us and saying, well, we have something to say in the matter as well. I personally feel that was a huge part of the healing. Some people talk about recovery versus healing, or recovery and then healing. To me, this was part of my healing, of being able to look back and say, okay, during my eating disorder treatment, I learned to see myself in a certain way. I didn't really trust myself. I thought of myself as broken, but now I'm taking this back and I have a voice and my voice is worthy. And all of us collectively, our voices are so important.
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to all the conferences out there that I've seen start to include more lived experience speakers in the eating disorder field as of late. As someone who will often, get those requests for proposals and stuff to speak, I always get discouraged when it's all just, you got to have a fancy degree up on the wall and a bunch of the letters after your name. And those are amazing people. Don't get me wrong. They're doing amazing work. But I think it's so important that we have the lived experience be a part of this conversation. Because like you were saying, Lerone, it can feel like, oh, they're talking about us, but we should be talking with them. So it's really important to always incorporate that lived experience.
And I'm sure that sometimes, by the way, some of those people with the letters after their name may have also had lived experience, but they're afraid to share it because of what it will look like. And so I do hope that we get to the point someday soon where people can openly, proudly share their experience, and that it would be considered a positive and a benefit, not something that they have to be ashamed of or worried about.
Yeah. One of the biggest things for me was post-recovery, and not related to my recovery, but I was diagnosed with diabetes later on in life. And when I started to work with my endocrinologist, she actually disclosed to me that she had battled an eating disorder when she was younger. And that connection was instant. And I was so glad that she made that, because that could have been one of those things, one of those curveballs in recovery that I was not expecting. But to know that my doctor understood where I was, made a world of difference to me. So I was so glad that she disclosed that, but I'm sure that wasn't easy. I'm sure that was pretty difficult. I'm sure she'd been advised previously to not disclose stuff like that, but making that decision really was impactful for me. Yeah, so one of the other questions that I found really interesting when we were talking about this the first time is that we're really, really good at saying, oh, I'm not sick enough for help. I'm not sick enough. I don't need to reach out. But then we're also not very good at saying, I'm recovered enough to help, or I'm recovered enough to do this. Could you kind of talk to both ends of that spectrum, how it's never enough, we're not enough?
I think that again, this is part of it is the eating disorder, because we do see it across the board for so many people, that idea of I'm not sick enough, which again is such a unique element that is in eating disorders. You don't hear about any other person really with any other disorder or illness complain that they're not sick enough and holding back from getting treatment because of that. And I find that to be one of the cruelest elements of eating disorders. And again, it's oftentimes amplified by the system. With access to care, with insurance companies, with certain stereotypes that some people have about what eating disorders need to look like, that so many people feel that they, again, need to excel in something in order to be worthy. I've said this, I wonder if it comes from the same place, if that voice of I'm not recovered enough comes from the same place of I'm not sick enough. I wonder if it applies to other elements, other aspects in your life. I'm not this enough, I'm not that enough. And if we can just say, this is my inner critic, I learned to recognize this voice, and I'm going to not listen to it, or I'm going to cultivate a different voice in myself that can encourage me, can empower me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're spot on, that this idea that a lot of us share, that unless I really excel at something, it doesn't count, or I won't be seen, or I won't be valued. Like, the only way to like ensure that you're going to be, seen for what you can do is to like be the best at it, right? And I think that is all bundled up with what I think is at the core of a lot of eating disorder struggles for people, is this like not being seen, physically or otherwise, not being recognized. So I definitely agree with that there's that pressure. And I mean, I still have that in other areas of my life. And I do exactly what you were saying, Lauren. I just have to remind myself that, there's value. I don't expect other people to be the best before I value what they have to say, whatever the best means, right? I don't expect that of other people. So why would I be different? And to really have a lot of grace and empathy, and it's hard. It's hard. It's not always easy, but it's a practice, ongoing practice.
Yeah, and what we say here also with people looking for help and not sure if they should reach out, and we always say, you don't have to have a diagnosis, you don't have to have anybody professionally, validate your experience. All you need to say is, I want to feel better. I want to have a better relationship with myself, with my body, with food, and we're here to help. So that's on the spectrum of not sick enough. And on the recovered enough, you don't have to be perfection. As I always say, perfection is an eating disorder value, not a recovery value. You don't have to be perfect at recovery to volunteer with us. You just need to, do the best that you can, and in the way that you define recovery for yourself.
Yeah, one of the things I found myself repeating to a lot of people lately is how eating disorders do not fit into a tidy little box. You are not going to check all the boxes off and meet this criteria for the different eating disorders. And I think for so long we tried to silo them off, and we've done the exact thing to recovery, where it's like it's very rigid and it's got to fit into this little box and check check all the marks in the box. But it's one of those things where we have to realize it's not black and white. It's not as rigid or as siloed as maybe it's been communicated for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so diving into the third part of our conversation, we've talked about the issue or the problem, we've talked about the impacts, but how do we actually reclaim recovery? What are some steps that we can take to move beyond the systemic shame and really reclaim our own recoveries?
I think part of it is what you were saying earlier, is even just beginning to tell our stories, even if we don't know what that is, even if we're still in the middle of it. We're all in the middle of our stories all the time, right? That beginning to value that, your own experience, that you've experienced this phenomenon, this condition, this treatment, whatever it is, this struggle, and that has value. You have things to share with other people just by nature of talking about what you've been through and experienced. And I think that's the starting point, is really believing or trying to trust that we have something of value to share.
something that I say both to people with eating disorders themselves and to others who are trying to understand it or who don't understand it, or who are supporting somebody who is struggling with an eating disorder. And this goes back to this question of people not understanding why people can't just recover. Why can't they just make that choice and do it? And what I try to ask them to, I try to ask them to look at it not as a, why are you doing this, or what's wrong with you, as opposed to what was so scary that an eating disorder, which is a self-destructive, really terrible way of life, seemed like the safer option. And that this is something that is hard to let go of, because that other thing that we were trying to manage using the eating disorder was so scary to us. So when I hope that when people think of it in that way, they can be more compassionate and more understanding of why this is so ingrained and hard to change, and why there needs to be a lot of love and support as opposed to a lot of shaming and punishing. And this goes to ourselves. Instead of having those punishing feelings of why am I not doing better? Why am I not changing my behaviors already? I should be in a better place by now. Why am I getting all this help and I'm still not improving? Have more compassion for yourself, because you're dealing with something really, really difficult. And only that compassion will help you get out of that cycle that, you know, keeps feeding the eating disorder anyway.
I think that is such an important piece that I think the general public doesn't understand. You know, it's not like eating disorders are fun. It's not fun. It's not like people choose it because it's like a great time, you know? So if somebody is doing that, that's because, like you said, it's like the alternative is worse or feels like it's worse. And so that's a really different way of understanding what is motivating somebody in this space than, oh, they just don't want to get better, or because they want to look like X, Y, or Z or whatever. It's a very different way of framing.
Yeah, I think to me, part of the thing that's difficult for me is this general idea that eating disorders have to do a lot with the media and with wanting to look a certain way, when most of the time, as far as I can see from everybody I talk to, eating disorders go far more deeply into different experiences, anxieties, traumas, fears. So maybe to the world on the outside, it can look superficial, like a superficial pursuit, but it is not. And that's part of what I would love for people to understand better.
I'm curious, we've talked a lot about compassion. What role do you think like community and connection play in helping individuals develop that compassion?
Oh, it's essential. It's so essential. Oftentimes, you know, I speaking for myself personally, times when I've struggled with that around eating disorder stuff or anything else, you know, if I'm just in my own head about it, I have my own narrative about what's going on. And sometimes it's when you see compassion coming from other people, or you see your story reflected through other people, it can really help disrupt that kind of cycle. For me, anyway, I think it's critically important. And I think also, you know, having compassion for others, maybe we can have compassion for people, other people, in ways that maybe it's hard for us to feel for ourselves. And so that kind of community, kind of circulation of compassion, I think is vitally important.
I love what you just said, because I find that the people who come to us, again, both volunteers and beneficiaries, people with eating disorders tend to be some of the most compassionate, sensitive, emotionally intelligent people I've ever met. And they're oftentimes, it's much easier for them to have those feelings towards others, but not towards themselves. And so seeing what you're going through reflected in somebody else, and being able to talk to them in that way, hopefully can also be internalized. For volunteers, a lot of the time what I see is that talking to the beneficiaries helps them feel like they're talking to a younger version of themselves in a way that they've never, connected to that part of themselves. But I think also, we talk a lot about eating disorders and isolation. Eating disorders lead to isolation. To me personally, and I suspect I'm not the only one, isolation led to the eating disorder as well. The feelings of loneliness, as you said, Rebecca, I think at the heart of it is feeling unseen for whatever reason. For everybody is different. And so being in a community where you can see that you're not alone both in your struggles, in your thought patterns, in your experiences, both in the eating disorder and outside of it, is such a powerful way to combat the eating disorder, because it takes away that shame, it takes away that isolation, and eating disorders thrive in isolation, and that's true.
Yeah, and especially I think for marginalized folks as well, it is so important because we've got those stereotypes out there that eating disorders only impact a certain type of person. And we know that's not the case. Eating disorders do not discriminate. So for me, it was really important to find other men who were battling eating disorders because it helped me feel less alone. It helped me feel like I wasn't on the island. Because at first, when I started eating disorder treatment, it was, okay, I must be the only man out there that's ever battled an eating disorder, because I was looking at all the materials that are out there and it was predominantly females. So once I was able to kind of find my people, find that connection, find other men, it was so important to me because I finally felt seen. I finally was like, okay, this is valid. What I've been going through, it is valid. I could see myself better in their stories and their experiences. And in turn, that helped me understand my own. So I know that that's probably the case for a lot of people who might not meet that stereotype of what an eating disorder is supposed to look like.
One of the most gratifying experiences for me with the mentorship program is with older adults. When people, most of the time when they apply for the mentorship program, if they're an older adult, they don't actually expect to have a mentor who's their age. And they're always surprised when they're matched with a mentor their age. And I think that is so empowering for two reasons. One is because a lot of the time, as you said, eating disorders are painted as this thing that afflicts teenagers. And for somebody who's older, whether it happened to them at a later age or they've carried this on for many, many years, there is that shame, that secrecy, because it doesn't fit that stereotype. But also because seeing that there is recovery at a later age and that recovery is always possible is something that we don't see out there in the media. We don't see reflected anywhere. And so it's so wonderful to, just like you said, to know that we at ANAD have a variety of people from every walk of life, every age, gender expression. And a lot of the time it really doesn't fit the stereotype. And as well with eating disorder type, which sometimes can also lead to shaming if people get misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. When they come to us, they feel, hopefully, I hope, welcomed and that their experience is valid.
I was thinking about, as you were talking, Lerone, about how vastly different what you just described is from what we were talking about earlier with this idea that, we don't want to put two eating disorder patients with each other because they might, influence each other negatively or, that kind of thing, and how different it is what you guys are doing that is really, drawing on the strengths of those community ties and what we have to offer each other, that I think is really beautiful and really important.
When I was younger and in my eating disorder treatment, when I started treatment, it was a long, long time ago. I hope things have improved since then, but they wouldn't let us see each other walking down the hall. They would separate us to the degree that we wouldn't even see each other down the hall. And it wasn't until later when I went to residential treatment and had group therapy. And it was the most validating experience of my life. All of a sudden, I didn't feel isolated, because before that, nobody understood me in my immediate surrounding. And that was the beginning of my healing. And this was when I thought, this is what I wanted to do. And this was many, many years ago, and I didn't think anybody would believe me. So finding ANAD was definitely the best discovery of my life.
Awesome. And now we're really happy to have you because you're doing amazing work with the peer mentorship program. So Rebecca, I know this is one area that you're really passionate about and that you've done a lot of talking about, is around advocacy. So how can individuals advocate for their own recovery, whether that's in a medical setting, whether that's with their family, their friends? How can we advocate for recovery?
It is challenging, for sure, depending on the setting. In my experience, I found it difficult when I would speak up about, like, this is what I think I need, or I think this approach is not going to work, but this one might. It was not taken seriously. Generally, it was seen as like, oh, she must be trying to manipulate, so we're going to for sure do the opposite of what she's asking, right? So it can be challenging for sure with the institutions that we interact with. But I think we have to keep going, like, and being clear about our intentions that, you know, I don't know what recovery is going to look like for me. I don't know if, you know, going in this direction is ultimately going to be where I stay. But right now, this is what I know is going to help me get one step further down the road. And just being clear about it, being, unfortunately, depending on who you're talking about, dispassionate about it. You know, you have to learn to speak the language of the people that you're talking to, right? You know, if it's medical providers, thinking about what are their priorities? What are they looking for? How are they making their decisions? And learning how to speak a language they can understand to the best of our ability. You know, we're also the ones there who are trying to get help. So, you know, there's only so much burden that a person can carry when they're trying to get treatment. But I think trying to understand the mindset of the people that you're interacting with and what their key priorities are, and then owning your knowledge about it and what you really believe is going to help.
I think if I may add also that there is a lot of the time, and it's good to validate and accept and anticipate it, that there is a lot of the time some tension between, is it my eating disorder voice? Is it my authentic voice? Is it, because the eating disorder is probably going to try to hijack or weaponize anything else in our lives to try to promote its agenda. And it's sometimes really hard to make that differentiation. Is it what I really need for my recovery, or is it the eating disorder voice? And if you can find somebody to talk things out with, I know that's something that the mentees do a lot with the mentors, like really trying to figure out, is this my eating disorder voice, or is this what I really need? And sometimes we practice that kind of self-advocacy before they go and talk to their treatment provider. But even just talking it out to try to understand what is really what I need, because learning to retrust ourselves is such a big part of the recovery process. And it's not always enforced by treatment providers, especially if it's in contradiction to what they think we need.
That's great. A great point. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and then another thing is it can contribute to an eating disorder, but it can also, I think, hinder recovery is the shame around maybe weight. So weight stigma and fat phobia. How do we address that? How do we advocate and dismantle weight stigma and fat phobia that might come from the system that could hinder recovery, or maybe our own internalized that can impact recovery?
I think that is something that when I train new volunteers, when we talk about body image, I always say, if you can do some psychoeducation around diet culture, around the history of fat phobia and the thin ideal, and if you can really get into that with your mentee, if they're receptive to that, that is oftentimes something that can become a really strong recovery value, can become a strong motivator when we understand the patriarchy and the system and racism and how all that ties together. And all of a sudden, you understand whether or not that actually aligns with who you are, your values, and it can become a very powerful motivator. So I think a lot of education is needed, and a lot of deconstructing of things that we grew up accepting as facts and that society to this day considers facts. And we will come across a lot of resistance from society about this because it really is so ingrained. So if we can, and I think as a community, and this is again where the power of community comes into play, because coming here and seeing everybody agrees on the same, most people, let's say, agree on the same values, it can really, when you go into that next conversation, you know you're not alone. You have all of these people behind you that believe in what you believe and that are rooting you on. So I think that's one of the things, at least, that could help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking back to when I was in my freshman year in college was one of the times that I was really struggling with my eating disorder. And one of the things that really helped me was, it's an old book, but it was one of the first kind of books to talk about this, is Fat is a Feminist Issue. And it really kind of looks at the patriarchal structure of diet culture and how we think about body shape and femininity, or, you know, whatever it is. And that started me down a road of really digging in and learning about what are really these messages that we are taking on and telling ourselves when we, you know, engage in these behaviors. And didn't mean I, you know, got better right away or anything like that, but it really started to give me a toolkit for thinking about what are the larger structures that are at play? And honestly, it made me angry, which was good fuel for recovery, right? Like, I don't agree with any of that. So I'm going to really try to work at working my way out of doing that to myself every day.
And also, as a continuation of that, is what do we want to model for the next generation? And it doesn't have to be having children. I don't have children, but as my therapist says, I have many, many, many children. All of my mentors, all of my beneficiaries, everybody who I feel that I'm nurturing towards is the next generation that I want to be a role model for. And so when we embody the values that we truly believe in, and when we don't go along, and sometimes we don't feel that way about anybody else but ourselves, and that's also important. We don't want to continue to perpetuate those again, shaming, stereotypical, damaging messages within ourselves, because that also affects everybody else that we come in contact with. So really thinking about what our legacy is, what do we want to inspire others to feel about themselves, I find to be also a very huge motivator for me.
Yeah, one of the things I also wanted to mention here is, I mean, I recognized as I was starting my recovery journey that I had a lot of internalized weight stigma and fat phobia. And it's easy to get down on ourselves or to feel bad because we feel that way. But I think it goes back to what you were saying, Rebecca. We got to get angry because it's not us. It's the system that has put this on us. It's society that has normalized it for so long. So if you are coming to terms with your own internalized fat phobia or weight stigma, it's okay. Like, you can work through it. Again, it goes back to what we were talking about: self-compassion, approach things with curiosity, learn more, and take steps to work out of that. Don't blame yourself because it's something that's been ingrained in society for so long.
Not only ingrained, but we keep having to swim in these waters all the time. So even if we're doing the work within ourselves, it's still, again, we need to validate that it is difficult to live in a society that keeps throwing these messages at us all the time and expects us certain things and judges us for different things. And so, as you said, accepting that not only is it something that we really have to work through on a constant basis to really root out, but also that it's okay to feel that you're worried about how the world will see you or what the world will think about you. It's normal. And, we're all just doing our best to live up to our values in a society that makes it pretty hard and challenging.
Yeah, I always say it's very difficult and challenging to recover into a disordered world because that's what we're trying to do. And oftentimes those of us who have gone through eating disorder treatment and recovery, we have a different perspective on it than a lot of the population does because we've seen the other side of things. So as we get close here to the end of our hour, which I can't believe we already are, if you're watching right now on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn, definitely feel free to pop some questions in the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to get to a couple of them. But I think before we wrap up this portion, I would love just to ask both of you again, like, what are some things that people can do if they are working on their recovery right now and they're feeling that shame? They're feeling that pressure to maybe conform to a different expectation or a different definition. What's one takeaway that folks can have after this conversation today to maybe test out moving forward?
I would say community. We need community. We need to not feel alone. We need to know that there are other people who are also fighting this fight and working out of, what we've been brainwashed into, and we need community. And I think ANET is a great resource for that.
Yeah, I second that, and I will add self-compassion. I think that is the probably most powerful thing to disrupt, again, all of those negative feelings and negative thoughts that the eating disorder is so great at really kind of strengthening and empowering. I think that learning to accept where you are now. Sometimes we think that if we beat ourselves up, we will we will move forward faster, but that's not usually how it works. And just accepting where you are now with compassion oftentimes is that thing that helps you grow.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we don't have any questions in the chat yet, which means we've wowed everybody, or everybody's still waking up. Because I know across the country, it's still kind of early up for our West Coast friends. But one of the questions that came to mind for me during our conversation today is, do you think that the fact that a lot of people maybe look at recovery as a destination rather than a journey, do you think that compounds to any of the shame that's out there as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not a destination. In my view, whether we call it recovery or whatever we call it, like it's life and it's ongoing and it's changeable and it's dynamic. And that's part of what's amazing about life, right? Is that there's always new things happening. So we're always developing and growing. So yeah, it's not a place you arrive and then you're like, okay, I'm done now. It just that's not realistic for anybody, in my view.
Yeah, I very early on thought of recovery as, oh, I'm going to be done at some point and then I'll just be carefree. And that was not a great idea because it meant that I was not aware enough when triggers did happen, and then I relapsed. And so I actually found it to be almost like I had blinders on because I was just so desperate to just be done with it and be free of it. But the way I like to frame it as now is it's a lifelong journey of self-discovery and becoming more, I don't just think of it as, again, the behaviors, which is something like the more clinical way of thinking about it. I think about it as self-exploration, as becoming more authentic, as using my voice more, taking better care of myself. All of those things are part of recovery and healing for me. So I think that I don't wish eating disorders on anybody, but I find that as long as I had it, I'm going to learn from it. And I'm going to I don't feel that I have the luxury these days of ignoring any of the warning signs, any of the red flags that my eating disorder raises. When I hear my eating disorder voice get louder, I have to stop and I have to ask, what's going on here? How do I take care of myself? And I feel very grateful to have this alarm system as long as I can utilize it for my, to promote my well-being.
I couldn't agree more. I approach mine the same way when those thoughts or feelings kind of flare up, because they do sometimes. For me, that's a sign. It's like, okay, like you said, it's like an early warning system. What is going on? Am I overtired? Am I too overly committed? Am I pushing myself? Whatever it is. And so turning that voice out away from being something that's scary that we dread, and just something that we can kind of reclaim as something we can propel ourselves forward with.
I love that you just used the word reclaim, because that brings us full circle, because it's reclaiming recovery. And you literally just said how we're reclaiming recovery.
Did it? Yeah, mic drop. Like there's nothing else left to say, right? That was the perfect closing there. But yeah, this has been an amazing conversation, a great way to really start the conversation portion of the day today. Rebecca, would you like to go ahead and plug your book? Tell us a little bit more about your book before we wrap up here today.
Sure. I don't have a copy of it with me, or I'd hold it up, but it's called Famished: Eating Disorders and Failed Care in America. And it's based on about 7 years of research that I did inside an eating disorder clinic in the United States as both an anthropologist and a clinician. And it's using that experience to try to make sense of all these broader themes that we've been talking about today, and why we are in the situation we're in, with so many millions of people struggling and not having the kinds of supports that we all deserve.
And I'll just say that I found the book so validating of just everything I've ever felt. So thank you for writing it. And I really highly recommend it, in case I haven't said it already.
It is an amazing book. It really is. And you got to promise to come back. The last time you were here, we already knew Day of Conversation was coming up. So we're going to have to keep this conversation going and make it a trilogy, I think.
I would love that. It's always great to talk with you guys.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. This stream's going to come down for a second, but I will be right back as we get ready for our next conversation, eating disorders and substance use. So thanks, Rebecca and Laura.